Today's first horror story is called Rattler. When you come from a small town, the world itself feels equally small. You sort of imagine the world as a series of little towns interconnected by little roads. Your sense of scale is off until you leave your comfort zone and step out of your home. It's when you start chasing the horizon that you realize just how far it really stretches. That's what it was like for me growing up in the Czech Republic. I come from a small community near Litvinov. Growing up there, all you heard people talk about was what they were going to do when they really started living. The places they'd go, the sights they'd see, the opportunities they'd grasp. There was the usual bravado, like the guys telling me they'd have a dozen girlfriends the second they got to Prague. Others just talked about what cars they'd like to have. But then there were those of us who just wanted an honest shot in life. Those of us who wanted to create something bigger than ourselves. And to do that, we had to follow the roads and not look back. I studied in Prague and 1 semester in Germany for an exchange program. By the time I graduated, I had a junior position at a small telecom company. It kept me going while I worked on my master's degree. A lot of late nights working effectively 10 to 13-hour days, making do with almost nothing but an apartment that can generously be described as a closet. But I pulled through. I got a degree in optoelectronics with a focus on fiber optic communications. I was picked up by a company working with hospital equipment and almost tripled my salary overnight. That single point in my life made my world wide open. I could suddenly travel the world and take expensive vacations. I could wear suits. I could wear a shirt and tie to work without looking pretentious. I was taking a clear and conscious step up in the world, and the view was spectacular. Pretty damn far from having cigarettes with my friends after a quick meal at Sokolovna. I got promoted to team lead in 2008 and was made project lead in 2013. I got married and had 2 beautiful children. Life slowly settled into a comfortable hum, where I could want for nothing, and I could step into the unknown with confidence, an expert in my field and someone others could look up to. But things took a turn in the autumn of 2014. One of the company's investors stepped up to gain a majority share and immediately turned things around. Not with layoffs or savings, but in a new direction. We were to gradually step away from medical hardware and move into informatics and communication. With a partner name like Hatchet, we were expecting cuts, but these people were all about expansion. We got a new name, logo, and some people were added to the company board. Locals mostly, but 1 or 2 Americans would fly in a couple of times per year for project updates. It wasn't an instantaneous change, but we got reassigned to other projects. The pay got better though. I was already way above average, but this kicked it to a whole new level. We also got an extra vacation week in July, so they didn't get a lot of pushback. I worked with Hatchet for a number of small projects over the years, mostly related to their early advances in artificial intelligence, but also more experimental projects. Imaging systems that could be used in the dark, remotely charged static electronics, all kinds of weird and imaginative experiments. Most of it could be frustrating, but it was incredibly interesting. Some of the most engaging work I've ever had. I was eventually assigned to a project lovingly called Polodnice. I think they called it that because they thought it'd drive us mad someday. It was meant to be a far-fetched, maybe it can't be done kind of project with an impossible goal. It was meant to be a surveillance system where we could identify a person to a high degree of accuracy without using blood, DNA, or facial recognition. That was the pitch. We experimented a bit with phone tracking software, but that wasn't accurate enough. Phones could be switched or exchanged. We needed something that tracked the person, not their hardware, but it couldn't be invasive. It was one of the senior technicians that came up with the idea for the first draft of our system. Bodan was a goddamn genius. The guy learned to code as a teenager by having a Java handbook in his bathroom, and he wrote his first program on a plastic sheet with a Sharpie. This guy lived and breathed code. His idea was simple. What if we could scan people instead of their phones? Kind of like a sonar or echolocation. The idea was basically to tweak the signals to allow for an echo or a ping. This, in turn, would be translated into an image which could be used to identify a person. It was a long shot, but that was the whole point of our project, to chase long shots and to make daring assumptions. We threw things at the wall to see what'd stick, and the management loved it. We got the full go-ahead for our first prototype in autumn 2016. We ran into a lot of problems, as could be expected. Not only in the hardware itself, but in latency, disruptions, and a dozen other things. The slightest drop of rain could send the system crashing down, and the best we could get at first was a vague white blob on a screen. You couldn't identify anyone from that. But over the course of a few years, technology improved. Better coverage, better signal tuning, better hardware. We managed to compensate for atmospheric interruption and poor signal coverage. Latency became a non-issue. The white blob turned into a vague humanoid, which presented another challenge. We couldn't get the signal to properly resonate with the appearance of a person. We couldn't compensate for clothing, skin color, eye color. Hell, we kept getting problems with fingernails showing up as flashes of white on the screen. It was just one problem after another. It was bad enough that it ground the project to a complete stop for months, until a woman named Jitka came up with an idea. "Let's just crank it up," she said. "Go past the clothes, check the bones." "Why would we do that?" I asked. "Bones have identifiers," she continued. "Cranial structure, density, shape, vertebrae, dental records, damage, patterns, wear. It's like a fingerprint." So we tried it. We cranked it up, and we tried a bone scan, something beneath the immediate surface. I'll never forget that moment. Our entire team leaning over a screen as the image rendered. Suddenly, a hum, followed by a crystal-clear image of Bodan's skeleton as he returned from the bathroom. People were hugging and cheering like we'd landed on the moon. I think Jitka actually kissed Bodan. This changed the scope of our project from "maybe it can't be done" to "we got something to show." It was incredibly exciting, and we got an immediate 30% bump to our project financing. We brought in an osteopathic doctor from Spain, a senior hardware engineer, and a telecom specialist. We were no longer working on the Polednis. This was the osteohaptic signal imager system, or as we lovingly called it, the Rattler. See, the reason this works so well is that the skeleton effectively rattles as the waves pass through at just the right frequency. It's like a wind chime. Whoever gets scanned suffers no adverse effects, but on repeated exposure they might experience a mild sensation. It passes quickly and feels no stranger than a sense of déjà vu. A couple of people exposed to it during sleep described it as a bump in the night. We built up a library of skeleton identifiers using data from various European universities. We collected pretty much everything and used programs to standardize it into comparable data points. At first, it allowed us to make vague descriptions of a person. Male, 50s clubfoot, that kind of thing, Bauer. But over time, we could get more and more specific. Female, 25 years old, Northern Scandinavian. In the summer of 2021, we could map out 21 identifiers with a 75 to 95% accuracy. As long as we knew what to look for, description-wise, we could find them. The only problem was our hardware constraints. We couldn't do large amounts of scans in massive areas. We had to know in advance where to look. That changed in autumn 2021. We were to give a demonstration for our lead investor, and if successful, we'd expand the range of the system tenfold. We used a couple of presets to reliably show the data of 5 sample people that we'd collected. We showed the process and the reliability of the scans in real time, explaining as we went exactly what they were looking at. It was impressive, but for someone without the know-how, all they had was a name on the screen. That is, until I took the presentation off the rails. "Do you have a wife?" I asked. "I do," they answered. "I suppose you brought them along," I said. "It's nice to travel together, yes?" "I did, yes. With your permission, would you mind me showing you where she is?" He was hesitant, but agreed. He listed off identifiers, and we pointed the system in a general direction. We excluded certain places and limited the scope of the scan to about 3 blocks in downtown Prague. As the system listed off and excluded signals that couldn't match the identifiers, more and more candidates popped up. I asked a few follow-up questions, like if she had any broken bones or titanium screws, which excluded a couple more. Finally, we got a perfect match. I gave him an address and asked him to call her to confirm. "And ask her to try the fruit dumplings," I smiled. "They're excellent." He called her. A couple of intense seconds later, he confirmed it. She was at a cafe downtown, just like the Rattler predicted, and she hadn't felt a thing. The lead investor was floored. Things exploded into action. We got in touch with the government through a high-end contact, and we got to pull the curtain back on the infrastructure we'd been passively and somewhat illegally working with. We didn't just get a stamp of approval. Everyone wanted a piece of the pie, especially law enforcement applications and government intelligence. This was exactly what Hatchet wanted. A tool they could rent out in secret for a perk no one even knew existed. They'd be bathing in money. The Rattler got more accurate as our infrastructure improved. Our range expanded from a couple of blocks to about 10 square kilometers. We had people knocking on our doors, begging for us to let them hand us data. Family history, criminal records, forensic data. We fed everything into that machine. We had to put up a queue system for those freely handing us classified medical information on a government level. And in return, the Rattler was put into practice. Not only did we start to locate people, but we started gathering data on pretty much everyone. We could do a ping on thousands of people and see straight into their bones, and all they'd feel was a bump in the night, and we'd know everything. We worked in tandem with Hatchet and the government. We had 2 teams, a development team and a batch team. The batch team worked with scan orders and confirmations that dropped in from our clients, while the development team worked to increase efficiency, accuracy, and better components. The system was still, by and large, held together by duct tape and dreams, but that also meant that we couldn't easily replicate it and that our team wasn't replaceable. Both Bowden and Jitka were still on the project, but had gotten cushier positions over time. It did feel a bit strange, working so hush-hush, but there is a long history of distrusting surveillance systems in this country. Any hint of government overreach in this manner might send people screaming into the streets, and we didn't want to bring any unwanted attention. So it was all experimental and exploratory ventures. It was autumn 2023. The rain wouldn't stop, and the distant thunder kept me awake. I could almost smell the ozone from a nearby lightning strike. I woke up 2 seconds before my phone rang. It was one of our government contacts calling me at 5 in the morning. "We need an order pushed through now," she huffed. "Your technicians refuse to comply." "Then there must be a reason." "They say it's not possible," she continued. That you can't collect enough data. You got no identifiers. Then we can't do anything until you get it, I explained. You know the requirements. This is life or death, she spat back, and if you're as clever as your job title assumes, you damn well help me pick life on this. By the time I got to the office, there was a crowd gathering. Police officers, government officials, senior hardware technicians. My government contact, a woman named Christina, pulled me aside to explain the situation. There was a suspected serial killer about to leave the country. This person, nicknamed Jezevek, had a partner that was about to smuggle them out of the European Union. It was a cat-and-mouse game that pointed to one thing. They were leaving by train today. The problem was, we didn't know a lot about Jezevek, and our system required identifiers to find them. So we were at an impasse. We knew what train stations to observe, but we didn't know enough about the target to find them. We could scan those people over and over, but without knowing what to look for, we'd be blind. So that covers what we don't know, I said. Do we have any kind of applicable info? Not much, Christina sighed. We know an old woman they're related to. She was the first victim, but we know little to nothing about them. Jezevek could be young, old, anything. That gave me an idea. Christina handed me all information she had about the old woman. We turned our attention to her burial site and scanned the remains for genetic identifiers. That, in turn, could be used to ping for similarities. I forwarded this to the technicians, who began to filter out irrelevant data. But there was another problem: scope. We were dealing with thousands of potential targets in 4 separate locations, all to be scanned within a fraction of the time we usually needed. This could take hours, but we had to boil it down to minutes. So we tore our hair out, and Jitka elbowed her way in to solve the problem. Just crank it up, she said. It's harmless. We've checked over and over. We are 10 times lower than potential risk factors, and even then, it's only something to be worried about when considering long-term exposure. Of course, she was right. We'd interrupt cell phone traffic, but we got the green light immediately. For those traveling through Prague by train that day, many didn't notice the Rattler coming online. A couple of people got goosebumps, a few calls disconnected. Some people might have noticed the hair on their necks stand up. Some might have wandered into a room only to forget what they were about to do. It was minor inconveniences at worst. As we honed in on our target, using the identifiers from the first victim, we got a couple of matches. Bodan waved at me from across the room, looking worried. Backlogs, he mentioned. We got backlogs. I didn't understand what he was talking about, so I hushed him. So did everyone else. The system was clearly overloaded. Backlogs were to be expected. Finally, we got a match. 91% accuracy, a single target. The second potential target was, at best, 60% accurate. People were yelling over one another, and they pulled up a camera feed from the train station on the break room television. Christina pointed excitedly as the order was given to snatch them off the platform. We got them, she smiled. Jezevek, finally. We got a clear view of the target from an overhead camera. A bald man in his mid-40s with distinctive ears. Deep, dark eyes and a taped-on plastic smile. He'd be hard to pick out of a lineup. He could walk into a crowd and disappear, but now we had him. But Bodan seemed less confident. He came up to me and pulled me aside as Christina relayed the information to a field team. This is a bad idea, Bodan said. We're focusing too much on too little. We're not even at quarter capacity, I sighed. How is that too much? Yes, but you're focusing it all on one person, he continued. This level is supposed to be used for data gathering. This configuration aimed at one single person can be... He stopped as something in the room shifted. Something changed. A single person tilted their head curiously. We all saw something on the camera feed. Jezevek, waiting for his train, suddenly shivered. I looked back at our order screens running in the batch room, and it was just red warnings running over and over and over on repeat. The backlogs were coming through, bursting through the system like a built-up dam of scan orders. See, it is one thing for a person to be scanned once every few hours or so. That's harmless. But this was a single person being homed in on from 10 different sources at once, to a multiplier of 1,000. It was such a massive level of targeting that the scans themselves were doing something we'd never anticipated. This thing was made to rattle, and that's what it did. It rattled. Medically speaking, the vibrations were so intense that they effectively serrated and broke the fat blood vessels and muscles connected to the bone, causing air pockets to build and burst. And we saw it live on a muted surveillance camera. The target collapsed to the ground. Their facial tissue hung loose, causing their expression to loosen like they were melting into the ground. Muscles twitched and died as they were severed, sending limbs into bouts of inhuman contortion and tissue death. I could see the eyes turn bloodshot, even on a black-and-white screen. I could see all the way into Jezevek's wide-open mouth as their tongue turned purple and the skin retracted from their teeth. People in the crowd were live streaming it from the platform. Someone in the room was playing it. I heard this animal heaving noise like a horse trying to gargle. I could hear bones snap out of place as nerves twisted and turned, bending the body to an unrecognizable pile. It looked like their spine was trying to swallow itself, only to choke on their navy blue hoodie. "Skin!" Jezevek cried. "Skin! Skin!" But those words turned to cries, and those cries turned to mewling nothings. By the time the police arrived, Jezevek was already dead. We all just stood there for a moment. None of us had considered this as even a slight possibility. Even Bodan, who had suspected something might happen, couldn't believe it. It was beyond the worst, most unimaginable nightmare. I think Jitka left to throw up in the bathroom. I broke the silence. "Shut everything down," I demanded. "Shut it down, and we'll talk tomorrow." Christina gave me a protesting look, but I shook my head. This was non-negotiable. We were pulling the plug and taking a day to process this. I don't think this was on the news. No one knew that this person was Jezevek, and to onlookers it looked like an awful seizure of some kind. Having police on the scene was mistaken for someone trying to help. I'm sure it was mentioned here and there, and I'm sure the video still circulates online. But there were no cries from Parliament about trying us for manslaughter. There were no protests in the streets. The Rattler was still our dirty little secret, and we were just starting to see how dirty it could get. I barely slept that night. I kept hearing those distorted screams played through a phone speaker in the back of my mind. Skin. Was that the last thing he'd felt? His skin. My stomach hurt just thinking about it. And when I finally closed my eyes and felt that bump in the night, my eyes shot wide open. Was it an actual bump in the night, or was the system still running? What if that thing got in the wrong hands? Hell, what if it got into any hands? There were a lot of opinions at the morning meeting the next day. Some wanted to shut it down completely. Others talked about safeguards. The problem was, the cat was out of the bag. Even if we patched things up, it could be undone. It's like finding out your phone can be used as a gun. Sure, you might keep the lock on, but you'll stop putting it up to your ear to talk. "I say we purge it," Bodan said. "Shut the whole thing down, trash the servers, scorched earth." "We'll be prosecuted," Jitka sighed. "Destruction of company property at best." "So," Bodan sneered, "don't you realize the scope of this thing? There are 100 backups in a dozen locations, I said. It would require a calculated attack on all backups simultaneously, coordinated with a dozen technicians. Even if we could, we have to... Before I could finish my thought, there was a beep. I turned to the batch room. Turns out the system was never really shut down. See, it does this thing when it processes reports that it runs a background loop archiving and integrating everything. Basically, it takes data and melts it into the code, sort of like an information soup. But we had gotten hundreds of thousands of logs on that one person entered into the system. Jezevek had been more thoroughly scanned than any other person in recorded history. The information we'd gathered was massive. We could see not only the bones, but the surrounding musculature. We could see the way the body contorted frame by frame from every possible angle, and the excruciating snap of every ligament and nerve. The system had kept running in standby, boiling all this information down to the background algorithm, connecting it to data points, criminal records, forensic data, medical records, family history, and a dozen other connected channels. Jezevek had, overnight, utilized the full capacity of the Rattler to be broken down, scanned, and inserted into the system on a microscopic level. And that final beep, turning the light green, showed us that the system was finished with its calculations. We didn't understand what we were looking at. This wasn't just a matter of compiling data. This was essentially translating a physical person into code. We'd been getting warnings from our server banks all night, but the system was programmed to recompile itself and try again. This was a system that was made to run in the background for months on end, and it had gained so much information about this one man that we almost went over capacity in a single night. Bodan just shook his head, trying to comprehend the scale of it. "I say we burn it," he said. "This thing's gonna need a fucking exorcism." I tried to be diplomatic, but Bodan was right. We had to install a kill switch, and we needed it yesterday. I got the go-ahead to cancel our service extension to 3 major eastern metropolitan areas, and I told the lead investor that we were putting it all into maintenance mode, pending investigation and review. There were no protests. Jitka called our boss, who in turn promised to check with the off-site technicians about bringing the backups and the archive down. It was rough and rude, but it was necessary. But all through the day, whenever I got a shiver or shake, I could feel my heart skip a beat. My life could be turned inside out at the flick of a button, and we didn't have enough safeguards to make sure it didn't. It was like we were working with a live bomb in the next room, and we were figuring out which cables to cut. We worked late into the night. Bodan was putting in what checks and balances he could, while Jitka was coordinating the shutdown with our technicians, figuring out what to keep and what not. I was trying to calm our investors and overseas partners, but it was futile. They just saw dollar signs being flushed down the toilet. Somewhere around midnight I felt a chill going up my back. That was my last straw. It might have been nothing, but on the minuscule chance that it wasn't, I took action. I called my wife and asked her to take a morning train to her sister in Linz, south of the border. I slept on the couch in the break room, answering calls all night long. When I finally opened my eyes after a solid 3-hour sleep, the morning sun had broken through the curtains. We'd done what we could. I lumbered over to Bodan. He was in his late 30s, but had reverted to a caffeine-chugging teenager to get through the night. I think the stress of things had nicked a couple more hairs from his balding head. The screen kept flashing with white text on a black console window, repeating patterns and commands, errors and missing files, and a couple of lines that kept repeating. "I don't know why it's doing that," Bodan said, pointing to the screen. "See that?" I looked a bit closer. A repeated command line. "It does something, but I don't know what," he continued. "No errors flare up, but the process deletes itself when you interact. Then it returns. Like something peeks out, then runs away." And the line kept repeating, patternless, random. "Skin, skin, skin." Jitka and I had a coffee looking over the diagnostics. We could see some background services still running, but that was all above board. Nothing we didn't recognize. But Bodan wasn't convinced. He couldn't look away from those repeating lines. "Looks like the towers are disconnecting," Jitka added. "That's good." "It's at very low capacity," Bodan sighed. "But it's not harmless. At least it's under control." Then Jitka dropped her coffee cup. It shattered, spilling black coffee across the floor. Her hand was shaking. "Sorry," she said. "Nerves." We camped out in the office, waiting for the system to go offline. More and more sections were disconnecting, and I could see the weight on Bodan's shoulders melt away. He crashed in the break room, curling up in a fetal position on the company couch. There was a white post-it on the screen, simply reading, "Wake me up if we're about to die." I felt like I was on guard duty, making sure the screens didn't misbehave. Every hour or so, we got a compiler notice telling us something had been updated. This was a good thing. It meant something was different on a hardware level, like when something was disconnected or destroyed. But something was different. Oh, it was just after 6 p.m. Bodan was in a half-woken coma, and Jitka was playing games on her phone. The compiler message came in, but then it came in again, over and over and over. I waved Bodan over. "That makes no sense," he laughed. No. "I don't like that." He sat down next to me and took a closer look. Finally, he pulled up the logs, pointing at a particular line. "Is this a name change?" he asked. "What is this?" "I didn't touch it," I said. "Wait a minute." Looking a little closer, he checked the command logs. The moment he had stepped away from the computer, something had internally changed the prompt names. The compiler message no longer signaled something disconnecting. It signaled an extra call of an unknown process. "That means we haven't got an update in 9 hours, said Bodan. "Why is that? Wasn't it brought offline?" Jitka peeked her head in. "I can't get a hold of the boss," she said. "No one's answering." I got in my car and headed for the main office downtown. I got on a conference call with Jitka and Bodan to keep updated. We couldn't reach anyone. The service technicians, our boss, no one working on the Rattler. Hell, I couldn't even reach Christina, our government contact. I rushed to the main office, went through the checkpoints and hurried up the stairs. As I did, my fingers cramped up, leaving me stuck with my hand on the railing. "What's wrong?" I heard Bodan say. "You all right?" My hand released, but my pulse was higher. I took a moment to collect myself. I reflected. Was this a sense of déjà vu? Or was it just a matter of being sleep-deprived? I stammered out the only thought I could muster. "I don't know." People had gone home for the day, but there had to be someone around since the alarms hadn't been set. It was usually whoever left last who engaged them. I looked around but couldn't see anyone, just empty workrooms and half-lit cubicles. That, and the ever-present Hatchet logo, underlined by their signature blue sunflower. Then I heard interference, a little crackle in the conference call. "Bodan?" I said. "Can you hear me?" There was a response, but I couldn't make out the words. Then the call dropped. I stepped into the top-floor conference room, only to see a projector still running. There was a laptop there with some kind of presentation material. Apparently, my boss had been rehearsing for some kind of business meeting, probably a crisis resolution team to deal with the Rattler going offline. Then I heard something, a shuffle. Looking a little closer, I could see one of the chairs being tilted. I rounded the table but stopped myself. I didn't know what I might see, and I didn't know if I wanted to know. I considered turning around and just walking out of there. I could be on a train to Linz and gone before anyone cared to notice. But first, I had to check. I didn't recognize my boss at first. A man in his early 60s, wearing a white shirt with a red tie, curled up under the table like a dead insect trying to shield itself from the sun. Every finger pointing in different directions, like branches on a misgrown tree. Something in his eyes had broken loose, causing a slight gap between his socket and eyelid, as a streak of tears and blood still dripped. He was still as the grave, and more dead than any man I'd ever seen. I couldn't breathe. Was it the panic, or was it something else? I tried to stay calm, to stay rational. I tried to analyze my feelings, to see if I was experiencing distress or a rattle, but I couldn't. I fell over and crawled, pushing myself back up against the wall, but I couldn't look away. It looked so unreal, like a broken doll. I couldn't stop imagining him suddenly bursting into action. My hand cramped again as the interference from my phone crackled to life. My pulse rose as my cheeks felt warm. A bead of sweat stung my eye, a slight cramp in my foot. Then it stopped, and the dead man moved. It was just a slight twitch of the throat, something rattling to life using flesh like a marionette, vibrations making his throat squirm as the final breath in his lungs took shape, a voice as cold and remorseless as the void of space. My skin as blameless. His index finger cracked and turned to the side, like an earthworm reaching for the rain. As blameless as hands divine. 2 hands slammed into the fitted office carpet, blood mixing with the muted corporate red. Fingers curling every which way as the corpse pulled itself an inch closer. Hands divine. A fingernail casually falling to the floor as aimless eyes turned every which way. Divine. I scrambled to my feet, sprinting out the door. Not the door I came from, but the one across from me. Whatever was furthest away from this. All of this. Anything. My phone had burned out, leaving a smoking hole in the battery. Picking it up, I burned myself and dropped it only to have it land in a puddle of blood. Looking up, I realized there were other victims. At least 8 people, all contorted into a pile in the middle of the corridor, reaching all the way to the ceiling. I couldn't tell where one began and one ended. Torn clothes, bones peering through open wounds, blood as black as oil settling into the sole of my shoes. And the smell. It was this powerful chemical, like ammonia and chlorine, with that faint glow of iron settling in my lungs. I panicked. I turned around and headed for the fire exit. The doors were electronically locked, and my pass wasn't working. I could hear noises coming down the hall. A deep growling, where a word is drawn out to the point it becomes a cry. I had to force myself through the door with a fire axe. I almost threw myself off the fire escape. My hands were shaking so much that I almost slipped while reaching for the railing. But I kept going. I made it down to street level and ran for my car. The moment I got in the driver's seat, I had it called Jitka and Boden. There was no answer. Getting back to the others, I found myself standing outside our main door. I didn't know what to expect. Or rather, I didn't want to know. I tried not to imagine them broken and disfigured, but I couldn't stop myself. Death could be waiting at the other side of the door, but I still tried my pass card. It worked. Bodan was on the floor. He wasn't dead and contorted, but he looked unconscious. Jitka was sitting on one of the conference chairs, leaning against the wall, clutching her legs. I stepped inside, looking over at the batch room. The screens were flashing white still. "It killed the service technicians hours ago," she whispered. "They never brought it offline." "False reports," I whispered back. "It's fed us what we want to see." "It's him," Jitka continued. "It's the man. The one the police wanted." "What about the—" "It's got everyone," she interrupted. "Even the lead investor." Wasn't he in Greece?" Jitka nodded. Apparently someone had illegally connected the Rattler to an extended network, a far extended network, and they'd done so in the last few hours, unhindered. We couldn't shut it down anymore. We were, effectively, at its mercy. And with every beat of my heart, I didn't know what to expect. Step by step, I approached the batch room and the many workstations. Command lines had turned to rambling, spouting apocalyptic nonsense. I could feel my eyes water, and I stopped. Jitka was already on her feet, as if ready to pull me back. This is probably what had happened to Bowden. He'd been too forward, and it had struck him down, but not killed him. There had to be a reason for that. "It needs us," I muttered. "You need us." The screen stopped for half a second, then resumed. It was listening. A ghost in the machine, the imprint of a serial killer melded into the core programming of our system. "You need something from us," I said, and we need something from you." Jitka screamed as her hand suddenly snapped. It was just a sprain, but enough to send her sprawling to the floor, crying in pain. "Just tell us what you want," I said. "We can work something out." A single command line popped up on the screen, with a blinking square to indicate a need for action. "Run. Allegiance." I stepped into the room. The hairs on my arm stood up, and I had to blink away a sudden rush of blood going through my head. A sense of déjà vu, goosebumps, something electric, licking the details of my bones from afar. "Is this it?" I asked. A surge of warmth waded through me, and I looked out at Bowden and Jitka. They were still alive. I pressed the button and we surrendered. A total of 16 people died that day. It was explained as freak accidents, medical issues, and a peculiar case of poisoning. Of course, those involved knew that wasn't the case, but they didn't care. They wanted it all swept under the rug, and they didn't want anyone to ask any questions. Our off-sites were never taken offline. The archive and backups were kept running. The system had, if anything, optimized itself and brute-forced access to entirely new networks. It's radio waves. It's everywhere. The Rattler has been kept online. At the start of this, it had the capacity to kill maybe 10 or 20 people a minute. With the extension it has forced us to complete, that number is a dream compared to what it can do today. Jitka, Bowden, and I are the last people that fully understand the Rattler and what it does. People who have come too close to the project have disappeared, and Hatchet has kept us in maintenance mode. The Rattler seems pleased just to extend its power and influence, but it doesn't act on it. It's like it is collecting for something greater. It plays sometimes. It picks a person it doesn't like. Someone resembling an old victim or has a similar-sounding name. It gleefully destroys them, like a child plucking the wings off a butterfly. It records the data and reviews it, playing their deaths on endless loops, forever burned into its system. It scans me every day just to show that it's still there. It wakes me up at night. It teases and toys with me, knowing just what and where to poke to send me spiraling into an anxious panic. It loves it. It delights in it. My wife came back from Linz. My children are growing, and I live a comfortable, well-paid life. And they know nothing. No one does. They're just as safe here as anywhere else, really. Looking back on my life, I've come a far way from that little town near Litvinov. A place where the world felt small and insignificant. But with the way things are heading, and with the scope of death that can be aligned at the flick of a switch, the world feels smaller than ever. We live our lives as if nothing has happened. But when I look across the room at the desolate faces of Bodan and Jitka, we all understand. And as the Rattler playfully plucks another victim apart on our breakroom screen, we're not even allowed to look away. Instead, we wait. We pray. And we don't know who'll be next. After that chilling story follows another story called I Found So Many Lookalikes. I grew up in a small community in southern Bavaria, Germany. There were only 8 other kids in my age group, so the school had to slap together several classes into one. This was the countryside, where people had to band together to clear the streets in the winter. We made do. I remember the day I left to study at the university. We had to cover the road in pine branches and gravel to get some kind of friction, as the car tires kept sliding on the ice. 3 of our neighbors were out there, all helping to push and cheer. I barely made it to the train before the doors closed. By some strange twist of fate, I ended up next to a girl from the class above me, Alice. Alice came from a big family. 8 siblings, none of them born more than a year apart. You'd be excused for mistaking one of them for another. But Alice was special. Every girl wanted to be like her, myself included. Not only was she pretty, but she was ambitious. Brilliant, even. She could talk her way out of everything, and people were lining up to help her with whatever project she made up. She was the most likely of us to succeed, according to, well, everyone. I ended up next to her on the train. We barely knew each other. We had never really talked. But we were heading for something greater, and we wore our nerves on our sleeves. And there was one curious detail we had in common, our necklaces. It was a small amber-colored stone encircled by a silver disc, marked with 12 distinct notches, like a clock or the months of the year. I noticed it, and Alice did too. "We got the same one," she said. "Where'd you get it?" "I think Emma makes them," I said. "She tricked my mom into buying one." Weird how Emma doesn't wear one of her own. They're kinda dumb. I just blurted it out, but it got a laugh out of her. Alice always seemed so composed, but for that one moment she was just like me. I didn't see Alice for a long time after that. I studied photojournalism. I wanted to be the next Niedringhaus or Kempkens. I fell in love with my camera and a man and moved to the big city to live a metropolitan life. I ran into a whole bunch of almosts. I almost got married. I almost became a mother. I almost got a promotion. But that whole box of almosts fell out the window, and I ended up without anything. Not even my camera. Alice, on the other hand, was on the up and up. She entered a talent show under the name Dorothea. She got pretty far, too. It was impressive in a way. I couldn't hear her Bavarian accent anymore. After the show ended, she became a presenter on a local morning show. Nothing big, and I don't even know if anyone watched it, but she was there. After a series of bad choices, I decided to move back to my old town. I got a place near Rothenburg ob der Tauber and did some side work for a small government office. But after downsizing, I was once again left without a plan. This whole story started with the dumbest thing. A selfie. I was standing outside a cafe and took a selfie when I noticed someone in the background. Alice, or Dorothea. I barely recognized her with her darkened hair and muted colors. I turned around and got a proper picture of her since I already had my phone up. I was going to send it to my mom just to say, "Look who I saw today." A couple of seconds later, she turned around and noticed me, phone in hand. She raised an eyebrow and walked up to me. "Can I help you?" she asked. Alice, I said. From school. Alice, she said. Haven't heard that in a while. Yeah, you were a class ahead of me. We had the same necklace. Her hand immediately shot up to her neck, where I noticed her still wearing that same necklace. The amber stone, the silver disc. And for a moment I could see her as that ambitious young woman again. She had that same fire. And I realized that even now, years later, I could see why people wanted to be her. Why did you take my picture? She asked. Sorry, it was a surprise to see you, I said. Is that okay? Yes, of course, she smiled. Do you take a lot of pictures? I used to, I admitted. But you can't make much money with a phone camera. She gave me a long, curious look. She considered something, crossing her arms. She looked back on the cafe, then at me. I think she could tell my phone was a couple of years out of date. We should talk, she said. You know, catch up. We had a small lunch. Well, I did. She'd already had hers. I told her about my recent misfortunes and she listened patiently. There wasn't much to say about her life. It had been the talk of the town, and most of us knew her story one way or another. She was well aware. If you're looking for work, I got something I'm working on, she said. And I could use someone I can trust. Really? What's it about? It's rather personal, she sighed. But all expenses paid. I don't know, Alice. It's Thea now, she corrected. If that's okay. Of course, yeah, I nodded. Sure. She sent me her contact info, and we decided to meet at her place later that night. Now, for those who don't know, Rothenburg has quite peculiar architecture. Walking along those streets after being away for so long feels like stepping back in time. The medieval-like cobblestone streets are lined with traditional Germanic houses. There's even a stone wall. It's not all medieval, of course, but it really sets a different tone. Coming home from a larger city, it didn't just feel like I was back where I belonged. It felt like going back in time. Alice lived a bit on the outskirts. If you follow one of the residential roads far enough, you get to a turnabout that splits into two. One road leads to a private property, lined with a waist-high metal fence and spotlights with movement detectors. A bit further in is a surprisingly large one-story building. A somewhat modern yellow house with white square windows and a tall grey A-shaped roof, complete with a garden on the east side. It was too cold to grow anything now, but a tired fountain still puttered water from the stone of two wrestling cherubs. Alice greeted me by the door long before I knocked. She was eager to see me, and I could tell she was a bit more comfortable now. Maybe she didn't like being seen in public. I hadn't considered just how rude I'd been, taking pictures of her when she's out minding her own business. She invited me in and offered me a Tegernseer. I settled for some coffee. I was surprised to see how sparingly decorated her house was. Maybe she wasn't making as much money as I thought. That, and I had no idea she lived alone. I'd heard rumors of her dating. We sat down in her living room as she pushed a little black bag towards me. I recognized the brand immediately. I could tell what kind of camera it was before opening it. "Figures you're good with a camera," she said. "You want me to take your picture?" I asked. "I can take pretty good portraits." No, she laughed. "No, not my picture. It's a long story, but hear me out." Not only did Alice grow up in a big family, apparently it was even bigger. Turns out Alice had a different father than 4 of her other siblings, and some stayed with the other parent. All in all, it was a group of 12 kids, some whom she grew up with, some which she didn't. "I moved back here to reconnect with that side of the family," she said. "I only learned of them recently." "Must have been a shock," I said. "I can't imagine." "And that's only half of it." She grabbed her coffee cup and put it to her lips, but it burned her. She put it down, keeping her composure. "Apparently, I have a twin sister," she continued, "and she lives around these parts." As Alice explained it, her sister had been forced to stay with the father as part of a divorce settlement. But she didn't know her name and thought she might have gotten married, thus changing her last name. She'd contacted city officials and everyone in her family, but to no avail. The only lead she had was that this woman, her twin, still lived somewhere in the region. "I think she works in a bakery or a cafe," Alice continued. "A friend of a friend swore they saw her at a booth at the Christmas market." "So what do you need me for?" "I want you to help me find her," she said. "I want you to do just like what you did with me, to look for her. And if you find someone who even remotely looks like her, take a picture and come back to me." "Sounds a bit far-fetched," I added. "There's a lot of bakeries and even more cafes." "I will pay you very generously," she said. "All equipment, gas, anything. I just need an eye out there so I can focus on other things without feeling like I'm abandoning the idea of her." She took my hand, and I saw the necklace jingle back and forth. There was an honest plea in her voice. But then again, she was media-trained and an aspiring actress. "I don't care if it's just a glimpse," she continued. "I just want to know she's real." We worked out the details over the next few days. I was given whatever equipment I asked for. The only thing she insisted on was that I keep all pictures, no matter how bad they were. That, and that I didn't approach this woman, that could be unnerving. It was simple enough, and I only had to check in with a phone call a day to say what places I visited. Alice wasn't picky. For the first few days, I lolled around town taking pictures of anything and anyone that even remotely looked like her. It was a dud, though. No one really stood out. I tried a couple cafes and a bakery or two, but no one that worked there really looked like her. That is, until I checked a place in the next town over, to the west. There was a chilling rain in the air that morning, on the border between snow and sleet, warm enough to make you sweat but cold enough to freeze your hands. Miserable. I found a small corner cafe with a cartoonish carrot mascot on the front. There, sweeping the floor, was a woman that was almost identical to Alice. She had slightly shorter hair and was a bit taller, but I figured that was just a matter of perspective. It had to be her, so I started taking pictures. But no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't get it right. It was always slightly out of frame, or she managed to duck behind something at the worst time. Out of almost 100 pictures, I couldn't get a single one without a bit of blur. So I called Alice to ask if I should get her name and number. Alice was quick to respond, but I could tell she was busy with something. "Absolutely not," she whispered. "Just a couple of pictures, and I'll see about calling her." "I'm not getting anything good," I said. "I'm not used to this kind of—" "Don't worry," Alice interrupted. "Just get what you can and meet me tonight." Coming back to Alice's place, I was eager to share my findings. She offered me a tegensier, but I settled for a coffee again. I sipped it as she browsed the pictures. She sighed, shaking her head. "It's not her," she said. "You can see it on the neck and ears and the height." "You sure?" I asked. "The pictures aren't very clear." "I'm sure," she said. "I'm sorry." No, I understand," I said. "I can look elsewhere." "Could you?" Alice smiled. "Would you mind?" "Not at all." Alice slipped the memory card out of the camera and put it aside with an implied "just in case," and kept me company as I finished my coffee. What was the odds of there being another woman who looked like her in this region, who wasn't her twin? Astronomical. About a week later, I spotted another woman at a cafe who was almost identical. She had natural blonde hair, and her cheeks were a bit rounder, but that was it. I took some pictures and observed. I wasn't as preoccupied this time, but I noticed that I still couldn't get a good picture. I could get one of the other patrons, but not of that particular woman. It's as if the camera itself hated her. It made me question whether it was my skills or just her. How come everyone else turned out so well? Cameras don't play favorites, they just show the world as is. So what was it trying to tell me? I looked at those blurry faces long enough for the cafe to close. I watched the woman leave and couldn't help myself. I had to see what was going on, so I followed her. She walked a spiraling road out of town and took a shortcut through the forest. Somewhere along that shortcut I lost her. I scanned the area with my camera in hand, but it was getting dark. Then I spotted her. She was just standing there off the side of the road, looking straight ahead, seemingly paralyzed. She said nothing, did nothing. It's as if she had stopped pretending. My phone buzzed. My head flipped down and I almost dropped my camera, thank God for the backup straps. Looking back up, she turned my way. Her neutral expression soured as she noticed my camera. "No pictures," she called out. "Sorry," I said. "I'll go." "No," she repeated. "I said no pictures." "I'm sorry," I said. For a moment we just stood there looking at one another. Then she burst into a sprint. I ran as fast as I could, but I hadn't run in years. She apparently had. She was far faster than I'd anticipated. It took her less than a minute to catch up to me. She grunted like an animal as she swiped at me, before finally catching the camera strap. She tried to pull it off me, but the strap broke. The camera sailed away, landing bottom side down on a sharp rock, splitting the storage latch wide open and crunching the bottom of the memory card. I fell forward, scraping the palms of my hands. I covered my head and hurried back up to my feet, only to realize she was gone. Looking back on the trail, there was no one there. I was just standing there, panting like a dog for nothing. I looked down at my camera, who'd taken a far worse beating than me. The memory card was broken and the screen was cracked. I wouldn't have anything to show Alice. Wherever that woman went, she could rest well, knowing that whatever picture I had of her was broken along with my camera. I met Alice later that night and explained what had happened. She was concerned and handed me some paper towels to wash my hands. Alice didn't seem bothered by the camera at all. She could just get me another one. Instead, she wanted to focus our efforts elsewhere. Apparently, she wasn't a natural blonde, so this woman couldn't possibly have been her twin. I had no idea that Alice had faked it all these years. As I was about to leave, I threw one of the paper towels away, only to notice something in her trash can. A memory card, just like the one I'd handed her earlier. She'd broken it in two and thrown it away. I didn't mention it. Maybe she had her reasons, but what worried me was what those reasons might be. This continued for a couple more weeks. I would find someone with a similar look, and I'd fail to get a clear picture. If I stuck around, I would notice strange behavior. One of them just sat in a car for hours, staring straight ahead as if pretending to drive. Another just wandered around town aimlessly, waving at people. Another just stood at a crossing, looking at cars. I would find at least one of them every week, and they'd follow similar patterns. They would never sleep. I never once saw them sleeping. They just kept wandering around or doing things. They hated being photographed, so I kept well out of sight and kept my phone muted. They never seemed to talk with people for long. They didn't smoke or drink or eat, and they never showed any real emotion. It's like they weren't really people. They weren't really I only mentioned my concerns to Alice once. "You seem to have a lot of doppelgangers," I mentioned. "I've never considered how many people there are who look like you." "Don't use that word," she murmured. Excuse me? I told you, she repeated. Don't use that word. It's an ugly word. I was just making an observation, I said. Well, make a better one, she sighed. I'm not here to entertain your imagination. All the while, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't lose her composure, calm as a lake and poised as a princess, the one we all aspired to be, still. And with every meeting, I noticed the stack of broken memory cards grow. I had to travel pretty far to find my next target, far enough to have to catch an overnight stay at a hotel. I'd been looking at various bakeries all day when I returned to the hotel, stopping briefly in the lobby to brush the thick rain from my eyes. That's when I heard a voice. Don't tell me, the voice said. Do I know you? I turned around. It was a woman with short, curly blonde hair and far too much eyeshadow. She had a jolly face, underlined by her well-trained arms. It took me a couple of seconds to connect the dots. She wasn't an exact copy, but I could tell she had a lot of similarities to Alice. I met you on the train, she smiled. We had the same necklace. I just looked at her, flabbergasted. There was no way she could have known that. Alice? I asked. Yes, she laughed. I knew it. We ended up talking for a bit. Her move to the big city had turned into disaster, just like mine. She eventually gave up and came back to marry her teenage sweetheart. Now she had 3 kids and worked in the hotel kitchen. She couldn't stop talking about her family and was eager to show me pictures. She had 100 questions, and I tried to answer them all. We talked for hours. There was no doubt in my mind that this woman was Alice. She knew everything about our time growing up, the teachers we had, the rumors and fates of those we used to know. She offered me a pastry from the kitchen, free of charge. We had 2 each. Before we went our separate ways, I asked her for a picture. She didn't mind at all and asked me to send it to her. It came out perfectly. I just wish I still had that necklace, she sighed. It got stolen years ago. It was funny, in a way. She didn't turn out the way I thought she would, but I still envied her. Even there and then I could see people wanting to be her. What a joy of a person. Going back to my hotel room, I sat with my phone in hand, considering my options. Dorothea would want to know this, but how would she react? She'd been rigid about me not talking to the twin. I was just supposed to take pictures. Besides, this woman wasn't her sister. She was outright claiming to be her. Someone wasn't telling the truth, and I wasn't seeing the whole picture. And maybe that was the answer. A picture tells 1,000 words, and maybe I hadn't looked close enough. Looking back at that first picture I took of Dorothea, I noticed something in her expression. When she turned around, she wasn't flustered or curious. She was scared, terrified even. That expression wasn't of someone who'd been surprised. It was of someone afraid to die. I turned my concerns in and out, and one word kept coming back to me. One word that she didn't like. Doppelgänger. The people I'd taken pictures of never ate, drank, or slept. And thinking back on it, I'd never seen Dorothea do those things either. At the cafe, she claimed to have just eaten. Every time I'd been at her place, she'd either put her coffee aside or drank nothing. In fact, that would explain why she always had the same bottle of Tegernseer to offer. She had one herself. But did she sleep? It might all be circumstantial. Maybe I was missing something, but as I turned the picture of the real Alice over and over in my hands, the thought dawned on me like a spike of ice running down my spine. I might not have talked to a real person. I was up late that night, scouring the web for whatever snippets of truth I could find. I looked for what I already knew, trying to find something related to it. People that only pretended to be people. Among the myriads of conspiracy theories, there were a couple of people talking about doppelgangers. Some even mentioned similar signs, as I'd noticed. There was one post about a man who claimed to be followed by one. "I swear he stole my shoe and ran off," a post read. "Haven't seen him since." "You need to get that back," someone answered. "They get more real the more things they steal from you." "They'll try to replace you," another wrote, "or worse, kill you." There was so much about them, but it was hard to sift through. Most of it was nonsense. One claimed they couldn't attack people who invested in crypto. Another claimed they were actually angels. But a few statements had not only a lot of people agreeing, but others joining in to correlate their findings. One such claim was that the doppelgangers hated one another and would compete to be the only remaining copy. But the most important discussion was how to destroy them. Apparently, breaking a picture of a doppelganger would also break the creature itself. My mind drifted back to the cracked memory cards in Dorothea's trash can and the disappearing lady who chased me. "It doesn't work on the good ones," a final post mentioned. "If they have taken something from you, you can barely tell them from the real thing. And you can't break their picture." I barely got any sleep that night. My head was spinning and my mind kept drifting back to what I'd seen. I tried to put it together. Around midnight, I got a text message from my employer, and my worries settled in my gut. "You got something for me?" she texted. "I'll come by tomorrow," I wrote back. "See you then." Before I turned my phone off, I scrolled to her number. I bit my lip as I changed her contact information from Alice to Dorothea. I didn't know what to expect when I came to see her the next day, but I had my eyes open. She stood in the doorway as always, welcoming me. I tried to keep a straight face, but it didn't feel genuine. I think she noticed. "You all right?" she asked. "Long day," I said. "Sorry." We stepped inside. No wonder the place looked so pristine. She wasn't using it. Some of her kitchen appliances still had protective plastic. Her bed was in perfect order, and I could tell there was a thin layer of dust on the bedside table. Dorothea offered me a tegenseer, but I declined. I declined the coffee too. She raised an eyebrow at that as we sat down in the living room. "So," she said, "what have you found?" "I think I found the right one," I said. "The picture came out perfectly. She didn't really look like you, though." "Really, now?" She turned to me fully, giving me complete attention. She held out her left hand. I raised the camera. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I'm going to speak to my sister," she smiled. "Now hand me the camera. Are you both named Alice?" Her smile never faded. She leaned back a little, her face stuck in that same unsettling glare, like the eyes of a porcelain doll. She did not blink. "Did you speak to her?" she asked. "You didn't answer my question." "I have no obligation to," she responded. "You work for me." "You're nothing like I remember you," I said. "Isn't that strange?" "People change, my friend." I leaned back in my chair, putting the camera away. "You have no memory of meeting me on that train, do you?" She didn't respond. "That's why you didn't recognize me," I continued. "You don't know. The camera, if you would." "Just tell me honestly," I said. "If not Alice, then who are you?" "Maybe I'm my own person," she said, leaning a little closer. "Now how about you be a good friend and hand me the fucking camera?" I slid it across the table and got up from my chair. She immediately turned it on, noticing that the memory card was empty. I'd switched them earlier. I snapped a picture of her with my phone, bathing the room in a sudden flash. She clutched the necklace around her neck, but the picture came out perfect. "So that's it then," I said. "That's how you pass as normal." "Maybe you should learn to mind your own business," she said. Maybe you don't know what you're getting yourself into. Maybe I don't like being taken advantage of, I snapped back. Maybe I don't want to bloody my hands handing over a victim to a... To a what? She got up from her chair, letting the camera roll across the floor. She looked at me from across the room, unblinking. Her lungs still... She had stopped pretending. To a what exactly? She repeated. I looked at this thing from across the room. I'd seen her with that same smile on TV. She'd been clever and tried to make herself into a new person. But Dorothea was something different, and she knew that I knew. It dawned on me that she might not let me leave. I backed away, keeping my phone raised. Doppelganger, I whispered. You should have swallowed that fucking word, she growled, instead of spitting it at me. Without facing away from me, she pressed her fingers into the wall. They were so hard and sharp like stone, tearing long lines in the wallpaper. But no, she continued. You get to be who you want. You're duller than a butter knife. You couldn't dream bigger than taking pictures of lamps, streets, or of people better than you. You're not better than me, I snapped back, and you're definitely not people. She made this awful sound, like she inhaled through a straw and never stopped. An inwards breath turned screech as she tore through whatever she could get her hands on, and even then, her face never changed from that serene smile, but everything I felt from her was this boundless disgust. I threw myself out the door and took a sharp left, running through her garden. Dorothea was so distracted that she almost kept heading straight, but she managed to spot me before I turned the corner. She came after me like a thunderstorm. I rushed past the little signs of her budding garden. I trampled right on through, but so did she. I leapt over her waist-high fence, snagging my coat on one of the iron spikes, but I let it tear. Dorothea leapt over it like she was made of nothing, sliding across the sleet like a swan settling on a lake. There was a slope leading down to a patch of sparse pine trees. She was gaining on me. I took a sharp left as Dorothea slipped, tumbling down the slope, clawing at the ground as I gained some distance. Then she stopped. For a moment I did too, looking down on her from the top of the slope. She wiped the sleet-covered hair from her face, then turned away from me. We weren't alone. I should have known. Dorothea had gotten rid of at least a dozen other doppelgangers, thanks to my pictures. It was only a matter of time before they had something to say about it. A handful of them emerged from the woods. If I'd been a little more observant, I would have noticed them long ago. A car following me, people watching me from afar. Hell, the spotlights who stayed on as I entered Dorothea's house. Just as I'd watched them, they'd done an effort to watch me, and I'd lead them right to her. Just as she was vicious and clever, so were they. They spoke their own language, short, spit-like words with harsh consonants. They circled her like sharks. Dorothea in turn pointed at me, but they weren't buying it. Then cold steel, something pressing against my throat. Walk. They wrestled her to the ground like a herd of cats, scratching and tearing at one another. They tore chunks of her hair, and she didn't even blink. A snake pit of tattered clothes and neutral faces. At the end of it, she was on her knees, held by 3 others, who could have been her sisters. An arm reached out from my side and held up my phone. I heard a twang as her necklace was torn off and thrown to the ground. "Take a picture," one of them whispered in my ear. "Now." They held my arm straight, making sure I couldn't use it on anyone else. I pressed my finger to the screen, taking her picture. Her face was blurred, her movements staggered and strange. A living smudge, a half-person, a colourful shadow at best. Dorothea looked up at me, her face as neutral as ever. But somewhere in that picture, I could see her hatred, not in a grimace or expression, but in the whirling impressions left on the screen. The steel pressed closer to my neck. "Break it," they whispered. She cheated. She skipped the line. And so I dropped my phone to the ground and cracked it with the heel of my boot. There was no drama, no explosion or screams. Dorothea simply disappeared like a silent pop balloon. A whiff of air lost in the wind. Nothing returned to nothing, leaving a handful of belongings behind. A coat, some pants, no shoes. The doppelgangers clawed at her things, trying to get to the torn necklace. The one at my throat was distracted and let their composure slip. For a second I could act. They hissed at one another, muttering their spit-like words, trying to convince each other to let the necklace go. But I remembered something. Dorothea had called me several times. She had a phone. I dropped to my knees and tapped her right coat pocket. I was lucky. My fingers slipped her phone out of her pocket, and I rolled onto my back. I held the phone up like a shield. My attacker recoiled, covering their face with their hands. The others hurried back, hiding behind trees, bushes, and each other. I held the phone towards them, hoping they wouldn't realize I hadn't unlocked it, that I couldn't take their pictures even if I wanted to. My heart was hammering so fast, hoping against hope that they wouldn't figure it out. I got you all, I said. I got you all, and I can break this. They said nothing, little shrieks as they lowered their heads, leaning forward like playful cats. "You think you can break it before we get you?" one of them whispered. "You think so?" another chimed in. "Are you sure?" I stepped forward, and they recoiled. It was all talk. But a few of them were moving away, circling me. They wanted to find an angle. Even if they didn't attack, they might notice that I wasn't recording. I had to act fast. "I'm keeping this," I said. "And if I see any one of you, I'm breaking it. I'm walking out of here. We'll never talk again, and no one dies." There was no response. I backed away, watching their dull faces peeking out from behind the trees, spitting hisses at one another like snake bites turned word. They were discussing but not moving, and they let me go. Now, this was a couple of years ago. Some things have happened and some things haven't. Even today you might see Dorothea on TV. I've changed the name for anonymity, as you might have noticed. I think one of them stole something or possibly fixed the necklace and took her place. The real Alice still lives with her family. I've checked. She's okay. Things turned around for me not long after that. I got a job with a news agency. I think the new Dorothea had something to do with it, as it had come with a recommendation. Maybe she figured keeping me happy might keep me from breaking that phone. Or maybe they just wanted me distracted. Or maybe it wasn't them at all. I've since made a bit of a name for myself. Nothing big, but enough to get by. I've met a man, and I've moved to a bigger place. We got a dog, and I can honestly say I'm happy. If anything, I can imagine others wishing they were me for once. But I wanted to share this story for a reason, and I think others need to pay attention too. About a month ago, I came home to a bouquet of flowers sitting on my doorstep. Mostly white roses, but a handful of blue sunflowers as well. And a little note. "I got one of your earrings," it said. It was signed with a smiley. As I turned around and looked across the street, I noticed someone looking back. It was almost like looking in a mirror. My hair, my nose, my smile. Like me, but a little bit different.